Welcome back to EU Democracy Explained. In the last episode, we explored concepts of democratic backsliding and its impact on the EU system of dual legitimacy. So let's dive straight back in and explore what the EU can do to protect our democracies. The European Union is built on a set of supposedly shared values among its member states, defined in the treaties as human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. But the potential of backsliding means that even if EU countries sign up for these democratic values when joining the Union, there's no guarantee that this commitment will remain during their membership. Article 7 of the Treaty on European Union outlines two procedures by which the EU can react to a country which threatens those foundational values. The first is about prevention and could be triggered by a reasoned proposal from the European Commission, European Parliament, or by 1/3 of the member states. Following this, and with the consent of the Parliament, the Council determines by a 4/5 majority, that is, 4/5 not counting the member state in question, whether there is a clear risk of a serious breach of the EU's fundamental values. The member state in question can argue its case ahead of the Council's determination. If a country is found at risk of a serious breach, the Council continues to monitor the situation on the ground to see whether the risk of a breach remains. The second procedure is about sanctions when a country is no longer at risk of breaching the EU's fundamental values, but instead is actively doing so. This procedure is again triggered by a proposal, this time from either the Commission or 1/3 of member states, minus the country in question. But, given we're dealing with something much more serious in this second procedure, the decision is put directly to the European Council, the heads of state or government themselves. With the consent of the Parliament, and after the country concerned submits its own view on the decision, the UCO, minus the country under review, takes a decision by unanimity. If the UCO decides that the member is in breach, the Council can then suspend its membership rights, including voting rights. This suspension is decided by a qualified majority of 72% of members representing 65% of the population. But this doesn't absolve the country in question of responsibility. It may lose its voting rights, but it still is bound by the obligations set out in the treaty, so this second procedure is therefore, in theory, very punitive. So, has Article 7 ever been used successfully? The short answer is no, not really. In 2017, the Commission triggered the prevention procedure against Poland on the basis of a clear risk of a serious breach of the rule of law, set in motion by domestic reforms to the media landscape and judiciary, which had been made by the government of the time. This gave way to a series of hearings in the General Affairs Council, and while the Commission did formally withdraw its region's proposal in 2024, this was the result not of reforms resulting from direct EU pressure via Article 7, but rather the result of the publication of an action plan produced by a new government elected from opposition in 2023. So less a question of Article 7's success, more a question of changes to the domestic political landscape. And let's take the Hungarian example. Since 2015, the European Parliament has been pushing for action to be taken in response to democratic backsliding in the country, and individual MEPs have called for Article 7 to be triggered on a number of occasions. In 2018, it submitted its own reasoned proposal, triggering the prevention procedure. In 2022, it reiterated that proposal and argued in a resolution that the situation had considerably worsened in the meantime, criticising a lack of progress by the Council. Of course, the elephant in the room here is that backsliding continues in Hungary. So why has Article 7 been so ineffective? First, let's look at the voting arithmetic. For the Parliament, all of its decisions have to be made not by a simple majority, but by a 2/3 majority of the votes cast, which itself has to represent a simple majority of the total number of MEPs. When, in the first procedure, the Council wants to determine that there's a risk of a breach, it has to vote by a special 4/5 majority. And when the European Council decides in the second procedure, it has to be by unanimity with no possibility for abstention. So if the country in question has a strong ally in the UCO, it gives an effective veto power that can put a stop to the whole thing. Lastly, and even if the European Council overcomes the unanimity hurdle, the Council's decision to strip voting rights from the country in question has to be done by a special version of qualified majority, Not the usual 55% of countries representing 65% of population, but a much higher 72% of countries representing the same population. Now, you can argue that part of this is to ensure these sanctions don't get applied willy-nilly, and you'd be right. But if you consider that the situation in Hungary seemed just to be getting worse, it's clear that none of this helps Article 7's effectiveness as a preventative or punitive measure. What else can the EU do to protect democracy in its member states, and in doing so, protect its own democracy? As guardian of the treaties, the actions that can be taken by the European Commission seem to be the obvious place to look. Let's focus on two examples. First, as part of its responsibility to ensure EU law is being applied correctly, the Commission identifies possible infringements of EU law and may launch a formal infringement procedure. It sends a letter of formal notice, which must be replied to by the country in question within a specified period. If the question is not resolved, it can then send a formal request to comply with EU law, which, again, should be responded to within a given period. And if the country in question still doesn't comply, the Commission can refer the matter to the European Court of Justice, where financial penalties are applied, taking into account the impact of the infringement, its duration, and the country's ability to pay. All of the Commission's monitoring and actions in view of suspected infringements are collected and made available to the public in an annual report on monitoring the application of EU law. But infringement procedures are only relevant to the application of EU law, and don't broadly reflect our more general concern about backsliding. In the case of rule of law, a crucial component of any functioning democracy, the Commission produces another annual report, this time to monitor significant developments, positive and negative, in member states' justice systems, anti-corruption frameworks, media pluralism, and institutional checks and balances. Beyond this monitoring, there's also the so-called Rule of Law Conditionality Regulation, in force since 2021. This regulation allows the EU to suspend payments foreseen in the EU budget. The Commission proposes a proportionate measure, and the Council decides. Finally, in cases where these measures are taken, the member state in question foots the bill for payments to beneficiaries. So, beneficiaries of EU funding should continue to receive financial support despite their government's potential breaches of the rule of law. The principle here is sound. The regulation makes EU funding dependent on respect for the rule of law, and can therefore act both as carrot and stick to incentivize respect for this fundamental value. It also serves to protect the EU budget from misuse by any government that may be consciously engaging in reforms that cause backsliding. In December 2022, the Budget Conditionality Regulation was used to hold some €10 billion of funds to Hungary due to concerns regarding judicial independence and respect for the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. Following a series of measures, the Commission considered that the conditions had been met to unblock certain funds, and Hungary was able to claim reimbursements. Now here you have a very concrete case where this carrot and stick approach seems to have worked. But of course, there's the elephant in the room. Despite the apparent success of this example, Hungary's wider backsliding problem remains. And here's the thing. There's a base-level issue with thinking of infringement procedures and the rule of law conditionality mechanism as catch-all solutions to democratic backsliding. First, the EU has competency to act only in certain areas, whereas we've discovered that democracy and democratic backsliding is much more far-reaching. This limits the tool's effectiveness in protecting the totality of democracy in a member state. Second, there's the more fundamental aspect that these tools are designed to highlight specific breaches and resolve them in a targeted way, using the carrot and stick of EU funds. They're simply not designed to be writ large protectors of rule of law or of national-level democracy. And even if they work once, these kind of reactive tools don't necessarily resolve the problem at its roots, so it can reoccur. Between the critiques of Article 7 and the limited application of tools like infringement procedures and budget conditionality, a picture is starting to emerge of a union that, despite individual instances of qualified success, struggles overall to guard against the impact of backsliding in its member states. So what might change in future? To help build more resilient democracies across the EU, in 2020 the European Commission adopted the so-called European Democracy Action Plan, renewing it in 2023 ahead of the latest European elections. In particular, the plan aims to promote election integrity and democratic participation, to strengthen media freedom and pluralism, and to counter disinformation. It will do this via, among many others, a series of legislative initiatives, including on the transparency of political advertising, recommendations on strengthening the safety of journalists, and a reinforced EU toolbox to counter foreign information manipulation and interference. The action plan was a real innovation, the first such EU plan dedicated to strengthening democracy. But criticisms around delays and slow implementation, as well as a lack of transparency in some aspects, have muddied the water. Nonetheless, by the end of 2023, when it was renewed, around 90% of its planned initiatives had been completed or were in progress. So, progress, but a mixed bag for the European Democracy Action Plan. To complement the initiatives undertaken as part of the European Democracy Action Plan, in late 2023 the Commission adopted the Defence of Democracy package, specifically aiming to tackle the threat of foreign interference. It does this by introducing legislation to enhance the transparency and accountability of interest representation on behalf of third countries, and by encouraging citizen engagement and democratic participation. At the time of writing, the legislative proposal on transparency included as part of this package is currently on its way through the institutional triangle. Finally, we can look at the change in portfolios in the Cabinet of Commissioners for the 2024 to 2029 term, in contrast with the previous Cabinet of 2019 to 2024. The new Commission structure takes themes which had previously been diffuse, like democracy or justice, and groups them together. In addition to a Commissioner for Democracy, Justice and the Rule of Law, there's the Executive Vice President in charge of tech sovereignty, security and democracy, whose work will include the overview and coordination of the planned European Democracy Shield, a cornerstone pledge by the Commission President to strengthen the resilience and functioning of democracy in the EU. You get the impression that, recognising the continuing threat posed by anti-democratic forces both in the EU and beyond, the new Commission, holding the right of legislative initiative, is taking the defence of democracy seriously. But there are also risks to this securitised approach. Heavily regulating online platforms, for instance, which in the modern world are such an important part of the public sphere, could be critiqued as a way of limiting the scope of the debates that form consensus in democratic societies. We're already living in a world where illiberal forces criticise the EU as too technocratic or too undemocratic, using this as part of their messaging to citizens with the aim of influencing consensus in favour of a less liberal democratic model. The difficulty is that measures taken to protect democracy in this securitized way could play into those narratives and serve to strengthen rather than weaken the very threats these measures are designed to address. Only time will tell how successful future plans may be. As we've learned throughout this series, the EU is designed around a system of checks and balances. The Union needs to reflect the views of a number of different stakeholders, and so empowers each with varying levels and procedures of accountability over one another. But the risks posed to the EU's dual legitimacy by the spectre of democratic backsliding in the member states is serious and ongoing. And up until now, the EU's ability to respond has left many critics wanting for more. So we want to know your thoughts. Can fundamental values like the rule of law or democracy be protected in the current EU frameworks, or are new approaches needed? And how successful do you think the Commission's efforts to safeguard democracy are likely to be? Let us know in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this episode of EU Democracy Explained. TEPSA does a lot of work on democracy, so to learn about what we do to examine post-truth and polarisation in the Reclaim project, check out this video. And to learn about our work on trust in politics and citizen participation, check out this video all about the ACT EU project. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe for more from TEPSA.